What if the world stopped treating the Strait of Hormuz as a battlefield and started treating it like a business deal? What if instead of threats, sanctions, and military standoffs, the global powers simply agreed to pay Iran to keep one of the most critical oil arteries on Earth open? Because make no mistake, this is not just water. This is the lifeline of global energy. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves through this narrow choke point. And when it slows down, the world doesn't just feel it shakes under it. Oil prices spike, markets panic, inflation spreads like wildfire, and suddenly a single stretch of sea becomes more powerful than entire economies. So the question isn't just political anymore. It's brutal. It's urgent. It's uncomfortable. What if peace in the Strait of Hormuz is no longer enforced by force, but purchased by necessity? And if that happens, what does it say about global power, control, and survival in the modern world? The world does not run on. Have ideas, speeches, or promises it runs on pressure points, and few are more fragile than a 21-mile stretch of water known as the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage carries the weight of global survival, where nearly every major economy depends on something they do not control. From a psychological standpoint, men in positions of power often interpret this kind of control as dominance. Who holds the choke point holds the narrative. It becomes less about geography and more about identity, legacy, and the instinct to be the one who decides whether the world moves or stops. That is how power has always been understood in masculine decision-making structures. Control the flow, control the outcome, control the fear. But there is another layer that often goes unnoticed in these high-stakes systems. From a broader human perspective, including how women often interpret instability, this same choke point represents something more emotional and systemic unpredictability that ripples into households, markets, and survival decisions far removed from politics. When energy becomes uncertain, it is not abstract, it becomes felt in prices, in security, in the quiet calculations of families trying to plan tomorrow. And in that contrast between strategic control and human consequence, the Strait of Hormuz stops being just geography and becomes a mirror of how power is perceived, exercised, and endured by different minds under the same pressure. When one choke point controls global breathing, power stops being theoretical and becomes physical. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a route for oil, it is a valve on the world's economic lungs. From a psychological standpoint, men in leadership roles often internalize this kind of control as responsibility mixed with leverage. The instinct is not just to protect the flow, but to own the decision of whether it continues. In high-stakes environments, this creates a mindset where pressure is not avoided, it is used. Control over a choke point becomes a symbol of strategic masculinity, where influence is measured by how much disruption you can create or prevent. When that same reality is viewed from a broader human lens, including how women often process systemic instability, the focus shifts from control to consequence. A choke point like this is not just a strategic asset, it becomes a source of anxiety that travels silently through economies, shaping household decisions long before any official announcement is made. Fuel prices, trade costs, and economic confidence all begin to react like a nervous system under stress. What looks like geopolitical leverage from one perspective feels like constant uncertainty from another, where every disruption in flow is translated into daily life pressures that cannot be negotiated away or ignored. The price of peace is no longer measured in diplomacy or goodwill, it is measured in numbers so large they start to blur the line between protection and dependency. When a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz becomes the center of global stability, every decision around it turns into a calculation where silence is not free and inaction has a cost. From a psychological standpoint, men in power often approach this reality as a strategic equation. They are wired to think in leverage, negotiation, and control, so the idea of paying for peace is not weakness, but another form of dominance. If you can afford the stability, you can shape the outcome without firing a shot. But beneath that surface, there is a deeper tension that both men and women experience differently. For men, the pressure of maintaining global flow becomes tied to identity, the expectation to hold systems together without letting them break, even when the cost escalates beyond traditional limits. For women observing or impacted by these systems, the same price of peace feels less like strategy and more like exposure, because every financial decision at that scale eventually filters down into real world. Instability, shaping household security, job markets, and the emotional weight of uncertainty that families carry without ever seeing the negotiation table where it was decided when energy becomes a hostage, the world is no longer dealing with resources, it is dealing with leverage over survival itself. In the narrow Strait of Hormuz, oil does not just move, it carries the momentum of modern civilization. From a psychological standpoint, men in positions of strategic authority often process this kind of dependency through control-based thinking. If energy can be paused, redirected, or restricted, then it becomes a tool of influence, and influence becomes a measure of power. In that mindset, the hostage situation is not only about disruption, it is about negotiating from a position where the entire global system is emotionally and economically exposed. When viewed through a broader human lens, including how women often interpret systemic vulnerability, the idea of energy as a hostage shifts from strategy to instability. It becomes something that quietly shapes everyday life long before it appears in headlines. Rising fuel costs, supply uncertainty, and market volatility are not abstract outcomes. They translate into household pressure, altered plans, and a constant recalibration of security. The imbalance creates a world where decisions made in high-level corridors ripple downward into ordinary lives, turning global energy dependence into a shared psychological burden, carried differently but deeply felt across both leadership rooms and living rooms alike. Power is no longer defined by armies on the ground or fleets in the side, defined by control over movement itself. In the Strait of Hormuz, what matters is not who fires the loudest shot, but who decides what flows, when it flows, and at what cost. From a psychological standpoint, men in positions of authority often evolve their understanding of power from physical dominance to systemic influence. The instinct is deeply rooted. If you can control the flow of energy, trade, and supply, you can shape the behavior of entire nations without direct confrontation. That shift is subtle but profound. It transforms power from visible force into invisible leverage, where restraint becomes as impactful as aggression. When examined through a broader human perspective, including how women often perceive systemic control, flow management becomes less about strategy and more about consequence. Energy flow is not just a geopolitical tool, it is the backbone of daily life stability. When it is controlled, delayed, or weaponized, the effects do not stay at the level of governments, they cascade into inflation, job insecurity, and household pressure that reshapes decisions in real time. The psychology here is different but connected. While leadership structures may focus on dominance over flow, everyday life experiences it as dependency on something fragile and constantly negotiable. In that tension between control and dependence, modern power reveals itself not in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to pause the world without ever needing to strike it. The real war is not for land anymore, it is for movement. Because in a connected world, control over flow is control over life itself. The Strait of Hormuz is not valuable because of what it contains, but because of what it allows to move. Energy, trade, and economic stability all pass through it like lifeblood through an artery. From a psychological standpoint, men in positions of strategic influence often interpret this reality through the lens of direction and control. The instinct is to secure the pathways that define global behavior, not through occupation, but through influence over circulation. Power in this sense becomes less about owning territory and more about owning timing, access, and interruption. When viewed through a broader human perspective, including how women often experience the downstream effects of such control, movement becomes something deeply personal rather than purely strategic. It is not just ships and oil, it is stability in households, predictability in markets, and confidence in tomorrow's planning. When movement is restricted, even temporarily, the impact is not distributed equally in theory, but felt universally in practice, shaping decisions about spending, saving, and survival. There is a quiet psychological weight that forms when systems people depend on become uncertain, and that weight is carried differently but persistently across societies. What makes this shift more profound is how invisible it is. Traditional warfare is seen, measured, and reported. The war for movement is silent, embedded in logistics, supply chains, and choke points that most people never consciously think about. Yet every disruption sends ripples that influence political decisions and personal lives at the same time. In this new reality, dominance is no longer declared on battlefields but expressed through control over flow itself, where the ability to pause movement becomes more powerful than the ability to occupy space, and where influence is measured by how effectively a system can be slowed without ever being visibly broken.